I'd like to welcome everybody here and thank the Lyons Muir Historical Society for opening up the museum and having us as guests. I want everyone to know that this coming weekend, all the little museums in our Tri-River group are going to be open for Spring into the Past. And this year, the feature is quilts, so you'll see lots of quilts out. So I hope you take advantage of that and go and see some of the wonderful museums that we have in this area. And this is only one fine example of that. Tonight, our speaker is John Simmons. John Simmons often comes to our Tri-River meetings and consults with different museums. He's originally from the Climax, Scots area. Climax is the home of Climax Prairie, which has an old Indian fort. He's a 1975 graduate of Western Michigan University, where he majored in biology, and of course that led him right into history. He moved to Alaska, Michigan, Caledonia in 1985. He's an early history buff. He's a Civil War. He focuses on the Civil War, but I also know he does a presentation on railroads. So I'd like to welcome John and his wife and son, and he will take over, right?
Excuse me. Do you have any more handouts?
Well, I'm sorry, we're having some.
I'm not sure what
If anybody has any expertise, we're always looking for some help. You know, it works at home, you load it up, we drive here, and now it doesn't work, so I don't understand that. So, while my wife's tinkering with it, maybe we can get it to go. I was here in Lyons a couple of years ago. I gave a little talk, and I don't know if anybody was here. Was there anybody here from the Lyons group that heard me when I was here a couple of years ago? But one of the things I talked about that night was the rivers, because it's such a part of our community for both Lyons and Muir. The river was part of our settlement. The river was part of the history before that, and the river was so much a part of the industry in those early days. And one of the forgotten heroes here in our river valley is Francis Bailey and Joseph Bailey. And Joseph was a Frenchman that came here. And I come out of Kent County, and if you go to Kent County, you hear a lot about Rix Robinson and the American fur trading with John Astor. Ada prances around, they own Rix Robertson. You go downtown Grand Rapids and they'll talk about the Campaw brothers. They'll talk about the fur trading business. They'll talk about Campaw Square, and you'll see that on Channel 8 News. And Campaw is everywhere, and Robinson is everywhere. And yet, right here, where we stand, we beat them all. We were here doing fur business before they were. The Baileys came here in 1792, so that's 30 years before Rix Robinson would see the Grand Valley. So we really have something very significant here. And he was a Frenchman, he married into the native population, and he was here up until 1809. And after 1809, he was to leave the valley. He leaves behind his native wife. She was half French from a fur trader, half Indian. Her name was Angelique, but her Indian name was Bidwewwe. And they had a child, probably a couple, but Sophia is the one that I've been following. Well, anyway, he leaves her here, so something really bad happened here at Lyons Muir. He left his business after all these years. He left the Chippewa, who he had married into, and he goes down to Indiana and starts over down around Chesterton border area as you drive into Chicago. Sets up a trading post, becomes quite important down there. Today there's a state park. Today some of his buildings still stand, and it's a major tourist attraction. He's buried there. His grave used to overlook the Lake Michigan before the trees have grown up, but they have a lot of Bailey history. They're very proud of the Bailey history. Yet before all that happened, it was all here. So we really have something that we could focus on as historical groups and as a community to build more awareness and to try to take that to a new level. So that's really a great opportunity. He did leave his wife and Sophia behind. And Sophia is one of the great characters here because she's married into the Indian family. She was taken in by Lowell's fur trading post, Madame La Framboise. who's famous in Lowell. But again, this is after the Baileys are here. Well, anyway, she raises Sophia up. Sophia would spend time on Mackinac like they all did in school, but Sophia grew up here on the Grand. She would, a lot of times the boys of mixed marriages would go into the business and become fur traders. The women would go back into the native lifestyle and go back to the people. And that's what Sophie did. She would end up living up around Cross Village up there and up by the Straits along the coast of Lake Michigan. She would marry a man, and her son would be a key member in enlisting men to join the Civil War. Both her son and her husband would enlist in the famous 1st Michigan Sharpshooters. And they would go off to the Civil War. This was one of the best units Michigan raised during the Civil War. And they both went to serve, and it's kind of sad. She lost her son and her husband serving in the war down in Virginia with Grant's Army. So when we think of the Indians, we don't think of Civil War service, but they had American pride. That was a big part of their story. So that gets us to tonight's topic. And I'm sorry, I've got some wonderful slides, and we got to get this thing going. But I'm going to talk a little bit about Arthurburg. When I heard about Arthurburg, and that was kind of a new, I'd heard little bits from Sue and from the Lyons group, but when I heard Margaret said they were going to have a presentation on Arthurburg, my first thought was, wow, I want to come to that. I'm interested. And she's like, well, we'd like you to talk about it. So, you know, it's kind of, so then, you know, your first thought is you're going to go do the presentation, you're going to go to the library and get the book. Well, there is no book. So it's kind of a tough subject to talk about. And like a lot of things, when you're looking for answers, you can't get there from here. And that's kind of true with Arthurburg. There's so many mysteries around what happened there, what it was. And also in life, a lot of times, you got to take the long road to get you where you want to go, and that's the quicker route. And that's kind of what I think Arthurburg is all about. There's been a lot written. I think a lot of it's wrong. And I think we've got multiple stories when we look at the Arthurburg Hill. And I think the first story is the most recent, and that's the village of Arthurburg. It's a great settlement story. Muir Lyons are just getting started up, and in the mid-30s, Michigan's going through a tremendous land boom. And Sue was going through the files as I'm trying to learn all these stories, and in the files here in Lyons, they have old pictures of plat books, and there's plats of the village of Arthurburg. And oh, it's beautiful. They've got parks, they've got government squares, they've got all these things, except for it was a paper town. And during the mid-1830s, with the land boom, everybody's buying land in Michigan. They're all coming here. Land prices started out $1.25 an acre, and just in weeks it could be $5. It was crazy, and it was very speculative. It was a terrible bubble, and a lot of people lost their fortunes. So there is a great story, though, of a man from Connecticut showing up with his fancy dress, and he's carrying his big valise, and he's like, you know, how do I get to Arthurburg? And one of the local settlers, one of the first men, said, well, it's across the valley here. It's just on the hill, across the river. So he's like, well, where do you get across the river? Where's the boat or the ferry? And he's like, well, how do you get across the river? Well, you're going to have to swim. If you're lucky, you might find an Indian with a canoe that could ferry you across. And he's totally aghast that, well, the founding fathers of Arthurburg must be irresponsible to be so derelict in not providing good transportation. At which he was informed that there is no Arthurburg. It was just a total speculative buying and selling lots. So it never was to come. So, you know, when you look at the history of Arthurburg, one is that story. It's the story of that village that never was. But that's a part of that early settlement. It's a part of Lyons Muir history, that the land boom, that everybody was rushing into Michigan. It was so much a part of the growth of Lyons and Muir. But as we look farther, we hear those early tales, and we hear those tales of the earthworks on Arthurburg, and what are they? And when I was preparing for this, I was kind of headed in one direction, and then about 10 days ago I got an email from Margaret, and it was an email, and it was a news clipping from the bicentennial celebration in Muir. So we're talking 1976. The Muir Council, some of the founding leaders, and they were having people that could walk up onto the hill. And was anybody here that went up on Arthurburg Hill back in 1975, 76? Perfect, I need to talk to you, I got so many questions. So, but anyway, they did some digging up there to see what the entrenchments maybe were looking like. They went down and kind of very amateur archaeology, but trying to dig out the sediment to see how big the trenches were and the embankments. And they had a big celebration back then. But they also talked about 3 mounds. And I thought that was interesting that there were 3 mounds located here on the edge of Muir. Now, I have looked at every map I can possibly find, and I've yet to find anything showing us where those presentations or those mounds actually set around the Muir village area. But that's significant because now we've got this round earthwork on a hill, and we've got 3 mounds associated. And there was a wonderful news article back in 2007. And in 2007, they had this article in the Weekender, Arthurburg Hill, had a nice picture of it in the fall. And on the back, there was a picture of it during the winter, overlooking the strategic junction with the Grand and the Maple Rivers. So it's a nice article, but it talks in here, and the author actually says that when I visited Arthurburg, I was struck immediately by the similarity to the ill-named Fort Ancient in southern Ohio, which I had visited. Well, Beth and I have visited Fort Ancient down in Ohio. It's an amazing place. In fact, we've been fortunate when we've taken family vacations, and Andrew played a lot of wheelchair basketball in high school, so we did a lot of traveling in the Midwest. And anytime we went anywhere, we're always looking for history places. We would visit a lot of the mounds and things that we would see. So Fort Ancient, we visited, and that's weird that when I saw this, I got this from Jeannie out of Portland, because that was my first thought. I went, wow, that's kind of similar, because you see that same thing at Fort Ancient. So what do we got going on here? Well, I think this is part of the mystery, and here I'm going to go a little different than, I'm not trained as an archaeologist, and I had a lot of history going to Western, but my background was in the biology, chemistry, mathematics, that kind of stuff. I tend to differ with a lot of the opinions of the archaeologists. I give more credit to oral history. I give more credit to the people's history. And as an academia, sometimes they like to disregard them. And I think a big part of this is the oral traditions of our native peoples. We're told to respect them to a point. And when they disagree with what our academic people say, then we have to say, well, we don't believe that part. So we're starting to get, I think, selective in how we treat the Native Americans and what we believe in. But if you look down at Fort Ancient, and you look throughout the Mississippi Valley and the Ohio Valley, and you look at northern Michigan, there's been a great show that was on TV the last couple of years called Unearthing America, I think it was. Scott Walters traveled around, and he always is looking at rocks and geology, and he's looking into all these mysteries that we have in the Great Lakes, because we truly do. We have all these unbelievable stories, and nobody really answers what's going on. If you go up to the Copper area, and you go up to Isle Royale up in Lake Superior, it's just full of ancient mining sites. Now, they've done carbon dating on some of the artifacts. They have looked at this, and this is thousands of years old. If you ask the Ojibwe, you ask the Ottawa, the Potawatomi, they have no idea. It wasn't us, somebody else. It's the ancient people. You ask them, well, what about all these mounds that you see throughout Michigan, and these earthworks, and all these ceremonial cells, are these yours? They would shake their head and say, no, those are other people. Those are ancient ones. Well, who are these ancient ones? Again, if you read some of these articles, they're going to tell you what was their ancestors. No, I don't believe it. I think that they would have had a memory. There would have been a gem there that was handed down. But also, they didn't live here then, so it couldn't have been. It had to be another people. And if we start looking at the copper industry, that copper business, and we start looking at the Great Lakes, there's some amazing things going on in the Great Lakes. And it really starts right here at the beginning. I said this to Sue when I was on the phone with her a week ago, is that this presentation is going to set the record straight that we're sitting in the most important spot in Michigan. Well, that maybe was a stretch. But it's kind of true. There's a lot happening. And when I say that, it's because when the glaciers start to recede, and the glaciers were melting, oh, right, good job, team. Takes a team. Then what happened is that water, you had a tremendous amount of water, and it's melting very fast. And if you look at the valley that we have here in Lyons, you can see the steep river bluffs. Now, you look at the Maple, and even on a wet year, that isn't a whole lot of erosion going on. There's not that much water. So how could we have made this river valley? It would have taken tremendous amount of water coming off that glacier to cut this ravine down through here. It would have been a gorge of water running through here. And originally the St. Lawrence Seaway is frozen shut. So what's happening here in Lyons Mirror, right where the Grand and the Maple are, it's one river. And it's flowing from Saginaw across all the way down through Lake Michigan and where Chicago is, where the Chicago River is, to the Des Plaines, to the Kankakee, down into the Illinois. That's one long river. And there is a rush of water coming through here. So it really, that's what is so important to, could you do the things for me? I'll hear about this probably. So, yeah. So what happened here is that, you know, that the levels.
Show me how you advance
Okay.
this without
Yeah.
a clicker.
You just kind of do these arrows.
Okay. You want it back to the beginning?
Yeah, we'll just go through them real quick. I'll talk while they can see them.
Okay. There's number one.
Okay. This is a Ojibwe talk. We see each other. And it's different than a hello. And I really like that, because when they would use that expression, we see each other, it means that there's this humanity, that it's more than a hello, that we actually are recognizing each other. So there's a more of a deeper meaning. It's a warmer feeling, if you will. And then you can just click, click, click. These are the pictures of the Bailey that I talked about. So I'm going to continue to talk until you catch up. Just keep going, please. And so we have the water flowing off of the glaciers, and that's so much of this area. And it becomes part of this important waterway that is going to redefine what happened here. And this is pictures, too, of the Bailey Graves that I talked about. It's a big tourist site down there. So moving forward, though, we get into this copper mystery. What's happening with the copper? And I think when you look at that, there is a lot of evidence that the ancient Mayans, this is from Crete, the country of Cyprus. We're talking ancient Troy. These people are wearing bronze. They wear bronze everywhere. Anybody seen the movie Troy? You know what I'm talking about. They are head to toe in bronze. Yep.
I'm
and,
not sure.
Yep. And
You want me to
it takes
stop.
copper to make bronze. You need tin. The tin comes from the Tin Islands, which is England. The tin mines are in Cornwall. But they needed copper. There is not enough copper in old Europe to supply their needs. So the unresolved mystery academia doesn't say is separate there from it. Where is all that copper coming from? And I put this quote in. This is an old one. It's been around for 2,000 years. But this was said, what is truth? And I think that's the important part of solving the mystery of Arthurburg. And I'm not going to get into religion here, but I just think that's a great quote. And it's a great question. And we just look for that sign and we're going to get there. But I think this is another one. You know, do we believe in ourselves? Because sometimes we can be intimidated by people with a degree, people that have a title. They can intimidate us in life no matter what we're doing. And sometimes, just like the Scarecrow, the Wizard of Oz is an anthology of different symbols, but the Scarecrow is the small-town farmer. That's what I grew up. That's what many of us are here today. We just got to have faith in ourselves that we can think for ourselves too. We don't have to be told. And the thing that we're always watching out for is this guy right here. All right? Because this guy is the great deceiver. He's the guy that acts like he knows everything. He's the guy that thinks he's in control, and he will pretend he's in control, but he is the trickster. And many times there's tricksters in our life that will deceive us. And here's the drainage that I talked about. You can see how the rivers were cutting across Michigan. It created what we know as Lyons Mirror and the river valleys. And next one. And here again you can see the paper town that I talked about and the old maps. And on all these too, there's none of the archaeology that we really are looking for as far as the earthworks. You see the road going up the hill just like today, but that's all we're going to find. And again, here's 1875. You know, Mirror's a boom town right now with the logging business. And here up to 1891, things really have stopped. There's not really the growth in the community. And we're up to the fort and the local natives that we talked about. There was an archaeology study in '92. This is you can go onto Google Maps now and do aerial shots. This is kind of an aerial shot of where we're at. It's kind of hard to see with the lights on. The next one, this is the ancient cornfields here. Here's the Grand River. Here's the Maple. Here's Arthurburg right here with the railroad, which is now the rails to trails. Here's the old riverbed where the Maple used to curve right up by the hill. And they cut that off. That's a swamp now. And they straightened the river out for the train line going through there. Next one.
Do you want this?
Yeah, thanks. I'm going to move pretty quick through these, but I think pictures are worth 1,000 words. Here's Arthurburg Hill. Here you can see that ridge right there. It's kind of a hogback hill. Here's a close-up. Here's the swamp. This is the old riverbed. And then the earthworks were up on this hill right here. And that's what the Indians told the settlers when they came. There's a close-up of it. You can see we've got some development. Here's the Muir water treatment plant at the end of the street. And then there's a fairly new house, I believe, that's up on the hill there. Here's a nice view from down below. And it's a tremendous view from up above. This is 1992. We had some archaeologists come in, and they did some preliminary testing here. They mapped it out, and here you can see the top of the hill. Here's that swamp, the old river valley. Here's the top. You see this line here? This is the entrenchments, and as they dug the entrenchments, the dirt was thrown up to form an embankment. They would have used the bones from animals, the hip bones, those are good, the shoulder bones for digging, shells, large shells, and this was, you see kind of a double ring there. And then here's where part of the hill was cut off for the railroad. When they came through, they kind of nipped the bluff off a little bit there. And then these are just archaeological test sites that the boys did back in '92. They spent a summer here doing a lot of digging. When you start to look at this, there is another link, and that is up by Grand Rapids with the Hopewell burial mounds. These are real famous in Grand Rapids. They have dated these back to 400 BC, before Christ, and 400 AD, the end of Rome. So there's a lot happening here on the Grand Valley. The archaeology work on Arthurburg, they did carbon dating, and that come back at 400 BC. So the same peoples in Grand Rapids are also living here in Lyons. They're doing things up on Arthurburg. What are they doing? We're not sure. What is it we know, and how do we know it? Well, this is Hinsdale. He was a famous geologist, archaeologist, and he wrote a book, and it was published by U of M 100 years ago, and it's the Bible today. And I have a map that you can see when I'm done here tonight, but he laid out for every township, each county, all of the Indian trails, all the mounds that were found. He put in the earthworks, he found the cemeteries where the surveyors, pioneers said they were, and it's kind of the Bible for the old times. And he talks here about down into Portland, the Looking Glass, we had some Indian mounds down there. Again, how many? 3. 3, that tells you something, that's a pattern. And we see those 3 mounds also here in Muir. Where do they get their information? This is kind of over in my neck of the woods on the Thornapple River. This is a famous spot, the Middle Village, which was real critical. But on these are surveyor maps. And these are the guys that surveyed back in the 1830, 32, 33. And they would take their chains, how many rods, and they would map out these lines. They'd put their 4 corners in. Then the second team would come by, and they would put in the section markers. And when they were doing that, they might say, well, at 5 chains, there's an Indian trail crossing. And so based on that, you could draw and connect the lines, and they could find out, based on those surveyors, where these Indian trails were. Great documentation. Looking here at Ionia, here again, half-mile west of Muir, Arthurburg, a line of embankments around the north and the east sides, enclosed quite a few acres, curved, very steep banks, formed the barrier on the other side. The walls of earth were originally double, as we saw in the chart, overlooking the low ground across and south of the river for a mile or more. So it would have been a quite formidable defense, as mentioned in the notes. Hilltop forts are very uncommon in Michigan, so this is a very rare thing. In '92, when the college boys were here, they said there's only like 10 of these left in the state of Michigan, and Arthurburg is one. Very, very special. 400 BC, carbon dating in Arthurburg, that's the oldest one in Michigan. Why the state hasn't done more to help you people, I don't understand this. You know, this is a tremendous site in the state of Michigan. So let's go back in time and try to figure out what's going on here. I mentioned the copper industry and the Mayans. There's a lot of evidence that they're sailing their ships from the Great Lakes across the ocean. They're taking copper back. Europe's more open to this subject than we are, because in America, we have a problem. We decided back in the 1880s that there was no cultural diffusion. There was no cultural, peoples weren't sharing across the oceans, Everybody lived in isolation. We didn't talk to each other. We didn't communicate. Everybody lived and just kind of minded their own business, and there was no big wars, and nobody traveled. And of course, it's just totally absurd, because if you look at Asia, you look at Africa, you look at all over the world, Europe, that is not what happens with the United States. And I totally reject that. I think this was a happening spot. You got a lot of waterways, you got a lot of ways to travel, and people were traveling. And they needed resources, just like copper. They were here, and they were here. There's evidence everywhere. The Europeans write about it, and they talk about it because they have nothing to hide. Here in America, we say everything has to be Native Indian. And I am 100% in support of the Native Indians. But we're not taking anything away. We're enriching our total story here as Americans. I'm a mutt. We're all mutts. I'm German. I'm English. I've got a little bit of a lot of things in me. If you go back 7, 8 generations, so that's true for all of us, including many of the Native Americans. So that's part of the American experience, is embracing the total story. But if you go back 1200 AD, even at 1200 AD, there's a lot of activity here in Lyons Mirror, and this is called the Woodland period. It's later than that copper period. The copper business has died down. Nobody knows what's going on now. That's lost mystery for us to solve. But we got another group of people that are living here, and we're going to go into some strange areas. So if you like watching history on TV, we're kind of headed in that direction. I'm going to put some provocative things up here. This is Cahokia, which is down by St. Louis. This is a monster site. It's a tremendous park. Much of this still exists. This is the famous Monk's Mound. I'll have pictures of that. You also see this round circle over here. I'll talk about that. But this was a huge city. At the time, it's as big as any city in Europe in 1200 AD. What culture this is, what people this is, academia, they can't answer that question. They're not sure. All right, here's a picture of the Central Plaza. Looks a lot like what you see coming out of Mexico. There's some tremendous similarities. You can get into the mathematics involved in this, and the math matches. You've got tremendous knowledge, tremendous amount of understanding of the cosmos and Earth and the interrelationship of mathematics. It's very complex, amazing stuff. These people were not savages. Okay, next one. Here's Cahokia Mound. You can see it's a multi-level. This is like a ceremonial. This is their main one. And at the top there would have been a little building that would have been like the head of the village's very sacred spot. And the total mass of that structure in St. Louis, the total size, there's more cubic foot in Monk's Mound, St. Louis than there is in the giant pyramid of Giza. Does that blow your mind? And it was built here in America. It's wild. But here, look at this map here. We're getting into celestial orientations. What do I mean by that? We're talking about moon and sun correlations, the solstice, the summer solstice, the winter solstice, lunar cycles. All the mounds line up to each other. Again, this town was laid out with tremendous education, tremendous knowledge. Here's what the city walls look like. Beth and I saw this when we visited. There's different periods. You see the old palisade wall here. Later they actually put plaster on it. It looks very European, kind of looks like Babylon walls. It's kind of wild looking. Here's that round structure I talked about. This is called the wood hedge. It's huge, and they think there were 5 of these at different times. This one's monstrous, and these are like tree trunks. They've stood up, and they're laid out in a very perfect geometrical slope. If you do from the air, what are we looking at here? And again, you know, if you're a farmer, you need to know your seasons, and you got to know when to plant, and you got to know what's happening. And this tells them that solstice. You know the equinoxes, you know the winter solstice, the summer solstice. Part of this also is religion. I've stripped out all the religion. We're not going to talk about that. But there's a lot of things here. It's for agriculture. It's part of their culture for worship. That is also part of this. Stonehenge, England. See any similarities? It's amazing. But nobody talks about this stuff. It's there. Also, one of the things I read when I read these reports is that Indians didn't do earthworks. Okay? And the next slide is an example of what you see if you go between Fort Wayne and Toledo up and down the Maumee. There were 3 of these, and they're 200-foot radiuses, and they were embankments along the edge of the river. And it reminded me of Arthurburg. These are Indian or pre-local native entrenchments that had been dug along the river for protection. So there are examples of this. If you look, you will find. Looking at a circle fort in Ashley, Ohio. And here you see an example. You know, again, the mounds are worn down because of the date. We're looking back. A lot of these in the early woodland, they're talking 800 to 1200 period, which was their peak. They started to go down after that. You also see these openings. They're like doors where you could walk in to the enclosure, but some of those aren't doors. There would be a ditch around the edges that you wouldn't be able to cross. These are many times called hedges. This is down in Indiana as well, very similar. I'm moving kind of quick here, but okay, I want to stop here. I want to show you something. Here's that mound. Here's that circle, the trench. You see the entrance, but we saw earlier that there's these openings. And over here are 3 circles, and they show you the summer solstice, the equinoxes, the winter solstice. And if you look on this side, you can see the mounds that were constructed. And you can see how they line up and how they're bisected. So those would have been observatories for the seasons. You see these in Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Wisconsin, Michigan. That culture was everywhere we were. This is the great serpent down in Ohio, down along the southern Ohio. This also dates from this period. There's a lot of symbology and religion here too. It's a giant snake, and at the mouth, it's got its mouth open, and it looks like it's about ready to swallow an egg. And again, you see it, it's overlooking water. It's on a hill overlooking water, very much like Arthurburg. Am I saying it's the same? I don't know. Question. Oh, look at here. Look at the bends in that snake's back. Was that done by accident? Absolutely not. With precision. The tail and the throat line up north-south. Again, you see the 3 compass points. Mirror, 3 mounds. Monk's Mound, Indiana, 3 mounds. Always see 3s. Fort Ancient, we started it. It's 2,000 years old is when they started it. And it's 260 feet above the Little Miami River, which we're a little south of Dayton, Ohio, headed down toward Cincinnati. Here's a map of it. This thing's monstrous. You can see up here, this is a couple miles of, it's kind of 2 hills, 2 plateau hills. You can see the degree, the mounds are massive. I had 2 giant mounds on the entrance. Here's another map, and you can see also some of the profiles of the height. This took a long time to build. One of the other interesting things on the side here is, here's the official entrance to it. And these 2 mounds still exist right up here. And then you see an entrance to a road, and then this is the extension right here. The 2 mounds in the road. Okay? Why is that interesting? Well, if you watch shows about Stonehenge, they will talk about the causeway. And if you watch shows in Egypt in the pyramids, they'll talk about the causeways. So again, I don't know anything, I'm not an archaeologist, but we got a causeway here in Ohio, and I don't know who built it, and I don't know why, but I think there's connections. I think there's similarities. And again, we're talking the dating. This goes back, this is a very 2000, but again, this is early woodland, 1200, same as we see here at Arthurburg at its peak. The view, very much like Arthurburg. Here's a view from the park today, looking out. You can see the river down here below. You're way up high on a bluff looking down. And again, that would have been a very powerful site. It's also key as an observatory. And the next slide, we'll talk about that. But again, we're looking for the conjunctions of the sun and the moon. Also, I haven't touched on Venus, but you know, the star, a lot of the Chippewa would have a star on the front of their canoe. And that was the morning sun woman. And if you've ever seen the conjunctions of Venus, it happens 5 times a year, and if you connect the dots, it makes a star. And if you go up to Canada, the Ojibwe Museum, they'll talk about the morning star woman, and it's the conjunction stars of Venus. And if you ask them if they know that, they'll go, of course we knew that. You know, it's in their culture, their history, but nobody told us that they had that. So again, you see cosmology, you see this understanding that kind of goes across the world. People were sharing information, and it was penetrating their culture, it was penetrating their religion. But again, we talk about these portions of the wall that were open. Also, I love King Arthur, one of my study points. The great Merlin, we hear so much about. But Merlin was a very real person. There was a couple people that carried the nickname Merlin. But this gentleman was up in southern Scotland, and later in life he built a tower. And his tower was said to have all these windows that he could observe the sky and the stars. Okay? and very well documented in Scotland. They believe it's real. And if we go to the next slide, here's Fort Ancient. Here's an example of the summer solstice, sunrise and minimums. Fort Ancient is mapped out. It's so complex. It maps out a lot of things with constellations. It gets pretty complex. I don't know the sky that well. Next slide. Here's one of those openings that you see in the entrenchments. Was this Arthurburg? I don't know, but you know, it looks like there could have been some. With it eroded, we'll never know. Those three mounds, they'll point to an observatory. Here's what would happen if you're on the solstice, winter, summer, fall, spring. The sun, you would have many times a rock, a ceremonial rock where you would stand, and you could watch the sun come up or the sun set through the window. Isn't that cool stuff? So again, here's a view. This is a very prominent state park that you can go visit now. And here's a reconstruction of what life would have looked like in 1200. Probably similar, same culture that we would have seen here. You hear different names. I don't want to get into archaeology because it bores me, it bore you, but they talk a lot about all these periods and the names, but one of the things you'll hear about is the Hopewell monuments, mounds. You hear about Edema mounds. Where do these names come from? This is kind of hilarious, really. Down in Ohio, one of the very first mounds that they tore apart, early settlements, they tore apart this giant mound so the farmer could farm the field. Okay, what was the farmer's name? Hopewell. Has nothing to do with culture, has nothing to do with the ancient people, the natives. It just happened to be on his farm, so we'll call it Hopewell. So all these mounds that are Hopewell, they're like the one that used to be on that farmer's farm. And then the other name is the same thing. Here's the Mediterranean trade routes, and this is kind of important because it ties into all this information. Here we are with Cyprus over here, the Phoenicians that are across the Libya, across North Africa, later to be Carthaginians. These people were always the great sailors of the world, and they would sail out the Straits of Gibraltar, Straits of Hercules. They would come up across Spain. We'll talk about that in a second. Along France, you see a lot of tremendous stone monuments here in Brittany, France. A lot of these are coded markers to show you the way to the North America. They come across England, through Ireland, past Scotland, and then you head up toward Iceland and Greenland. There's really only a couple places that you have a couple days journey between land. It's not as dangerous as you think. And of course we have legends of the great Irish monk coming in 600, St. Brennan. And the Irish talk about him coming to America. But once you get up there, you just follow the currents, you just move along, you come into way up north into Canada, and from there you can come into Hudson Bay, down into James Bay. The rivers will take you right down into the upper Great Lakes. And of course, a lot of work now being done about the Vikings, Scandinavians coming back the same trail in 1000. So they did that. The Great Lakes, much of this time period, the Great Lakes were very different than today. And you could actually sail out of the Great Lakes going out the Ottawa River, and you would end up at the St. Lawrence where Montreal is today. You have a thing called glacial uplift, where the land will come up. We had tons and tons, millions of tons of ice sitting on Michigan, and it pressed us down. Well, once that melted, for many years, and I still think it's true, we're still seeing that, because the land today is so much drier than it was 100 years ago. You read the old histories, it's drier than it was 200 years ago. And the natives in 1830 would tell the settlers the land's dried out. And that was before even irrigation and the drainage ditches were put in. So Michigan's been lifting up, and as we've lifted up, it cut off this passageway that the Europeans could flow, and then trade started to go back the other way down the Mississippi. Now we're going to get into some strange stuff, but this is quite interesting. Again, stripped out the religion, but this story is universally known by all the major religions. The story of David and Goliath, and this Goliath was a monster of a man. And is it true or is it not true? Well, let's look at North America and let's look at the history that we can find out from them. And this has a lot to do with the concept that academia says that it can't be a fort because Native Americans didn't build forts and there was no big wars like that going on, so it can't happen. So my premise would be wrong. So as we look at the evidence and we start to see what they had to say, they will start to talk about a giant race of white people. And this is coming from, these people spoke different languages. They all had the same legend though. They come from different parts of the United States. They all have the same legends. Here in the Chippewa, they talk about the former white race that mined the Wisconsin copper. So we're told we don't know who did it. The Chippewas, one of their legends is it was white people. They don't know where they were from. The Delaware, this is a tribe that used to be out west. I just read this a couple weeks ago. They actually were the other side of the Mississippi. I didn't know that, but they ended up coming all the way over to Pennsylvania. But they sent spies across the Mississippi to see what was ahead, and the spies came back and said, oh boy, we got problems. You know, these are very powerful people. They have great villages surrounded by high walls. They are very tall, so tall the head of the tallest Lenape, Delaware, couldn't reach their arms. So these were stories. The Delaware and the Shawnee came over and eventually defeated them in battle. This is the story of their migration across the United States. Next one. Here's the Comanches out west. What did they have to talk about? This was 1857, a race of white men, 10 feet high. Their fortification crowned the summits of the mountains, so they always build on hills. Next one. Comanches. Compared with them, the pale faces of the present days are pygmies, both in art and arms. What they're talking here by art is the sciences, what they could do. The Cheyennes recognize these people know a lot. Navajo out west. They call the Star Date people, the white giants. White giants endowed with mining technology who dominated. They enslaved the lesser tribes. This is also a common thing you hear in all their oral histories. And again, these people speak different languages. Native Americans, there's a lot of different linguistics. Next one, Choctaw down south, a race of giants that inhabited what is now Tennessee. Their name for the giant race and their wonderful stature. So as we look, here's the Paiutes. You see the same thing, red hair, 10 feet tall. And you can go home and start Googling this and take a different tribe, and you'll find these same stories. It's pretty wild. Down to Peru, you see the same thing. Why is this important? You know, is that we do have a link here to the Midwest. And that is DNA analysis. If you look and you read Ionia County histories, Montcalm, Shiawassee, one of the things you'll read when you read those township histories that were written in 1779, 1780, they'll talk about some of these mounds on the different farmers. And these are usually our leading citizens. They were the doctor, they were a businessman, they would go out with a farmer, they'd dig up that mound to see what they found. They'd find some Indian artifacts many times. One of the things they would find, and this is true, Kalamazoo County, we had a lot of this. They found giant skeletons that blew their mind. Nobody's answered our leading citizens. And this wasn't a bunch of pranksters, hucksters, P.T. Barnum. These were our leading citizens, our leading farmers in our communities that testified to this and wrote these stories. You'll find these articles in our old newspapers. So as we look at, if you go back one, when we start to look at the DNA, this is all new stuff that we didn't used to have. They can take our DNA and do our ancestry. They're doing that for Native Americans. And one of the things is your mitochondrial, your cell DNA. And when they do that, they find that Native Americans have something very unusual. Their DNA is coming out of Europe and the Middle East. It's not coming out of Asia. They didn't come across the Bering Straits. That story does not fly. They had to come to America in ancient times across the water. So it's proof that can't be denied. And as we look at this, here's the old pirate mark. X marks the spot. And what do we find? Spain, Bulgaria, Finland, Italy, Israel. Italy, of course, in the Mediterranean. Israel, where you find Phoenicia, where you find the Cyprus, all the great sailors. And of course, Israel was a major powerhouse back then, and they also sailed. Solomon had a great fleet. So as we look forward, this is kind of weird stuff. But archaeologists, geneticists are certain this is not from intermarriages. It is of ancient origin. And if you look down here, it has been found to be a larger degree in Ojibwe tribes and the Oneida, or Onita, which is that Mississippian river culture that we just talked about. So this is kind of, you don't hear much about this or see it, but this is, again, all this can be verified. I like this because Elvis was big when I was a kid, and Elvis Presley would always tell everyone he was part Jewish and part Cherokee. Nobody ever believed him. And why he knew that was because his mother told him. Because her mother had told her. And this is called family history. It's very much part of climax history, whether it's Lyons, whether it's Mirror. Our ancestors told us stories, and those stories, by and large, are true. They could be a little twisted or confused, but we have to believe the essence of it. But Elvis believed he was Jewish and Cherokee. 2004, they did a test at one of his specimens, and sure enough, his mother came out of the Cherokee tribe, and she was part Jewish. And many of the Cherokees carry that gene. So again, we're kind of getting into some wild stuff. But the Cherokees also have another group which comes out of Egypt. Now we're starting to get crazy. And there's another group of U that's starting to come up there in Turkey and Greece. It gets repetitive, but what's happening? We keep pointing our finger to the Mediterranean. We keep pointing our finger to all the ancient tales are true. Science won't admit it though. But of course, you know, in today's world, everybody's like this. I'm an archaeologist, I'm a genetics guy, I'm a history guy, and these people aren't multidisciplined. They need to all get together in one room and share their information because it would rewrite our textbooks, which of course, guys make a lot of money selling textbooks. I don't. So we went from DNA, let's look at the alphabet real quick. This is really cool. This was been on TV. This is up at St. Ignace in the museum up there at Fort de Bod. Is it fake? Is it real? Everybody tells us it's fake. Here is the Sutton Land deal, dated 1681. This was done with the Plymouth colony. It's only 61 years old. This was up in New Hampshire to get some land. The natives are signing using their Nipquah language. And I want to point out something here. One of the Indians signed in English, and I'm amazed. Man, that guy learned how to write in English already. So again, these people weren't ignorant. They're very smart people. Here you can see they're using English alphabet for their initials. Pretty amazing. Here's another Indian. Now look what he signed. This is his signature. If you use the alphabet from Cyprus, that's what it looks like. He is using an ancient Mediterranean language that is not used any longer, but it was being used in New Hampshire. If you look at the second page, here's the Indians' mark that they used. Here's the Cyprus. You can see the similarities. How this is happening, you don't know. We still have a similar form of this with the Cree, which is related to the Ojibwe. Some of the northern Ojibwe still use this. They have a written symbology that derives from Cyprus. I never knew this. This is new. Next one. So, moving forward, we've talked a lot about it. When we start to talk about Arthurburg, we definitely see that there's much more to this, and that we had ancient people sitting here in the Grand Valley. What time is it? Anybody have?
7:30.
7:30? How much time do I have? Oh, okay. All right. I'll move quick. Now we're going to move forward to the Ottawa period. And this is real important, and there's a lot here, but we're going to do it like a movie. But everybody's seen the Fort Michilimackinac up at the Straits. It's so much part of our history. You know, that's 200 years old. Just last summer, they had a big celebration. But when we start to look at Michigan, you know, the tribes that were here, and we go back to first contact. This is the same time that the Pilgrims are over on the Plymouth colony. So we're talking 1620. You don't see any Ottawa here. You don't see any Chippewa here. Michigan was a very different place, and the tribes are in a different place. But you can see that throughout this, there's going to be a lot of warfare. And we always talk about white guilt. And I don't have any white guilt. Okay, I did not do anything wrong in 1600. I didn't do anything wrong in 1800. And I can't be held accountable for what people did back there. So we can put the white guilt in a box. Okay, bad things were done by everybody. I think that's part of the American experience. We just accept that's part of our history. But as we go forward, you're going to see some slides here about how people moved. And this was due to warfare and diseases. But at the same time, the beaver pelts were really popular in Europe, and they're hunting beaver. They're worth a lot. There was a lot of competition for hunting grounds. As the tribes got into each other, they fought for this. The #1 offender is the Iroquois out of New York. And you can see western New York, we're talking Mohawk and Oneida. These guys are bad guys, but they're held up in their history books. We're told the Iroquois are just such a wonderful nation, and they had a constitution, and they had women's rights, and they had all this, and they just murdered the heck out of the Midwest back then. They were bad, bad people. Their #1 enemy were the Huron. Here's Magua from the famous French and Indian movie, Last of the Mohicans. He was a Huron. The Huron were a tribe up here. The Iroquois went after them in a series of wars, and the Huron Nation, thousands and thousands and thousands of people were killed. Women, children, men. The remnants were adopted into the Iroquois Nation. Those that flee, they started to flee up through the Great Lakes, first up to St. Ignace. They eventually come up over here into Green Bay, up into Wisconsin, trying to get away from the Iroquois. Later, they will settle in Detroit. Another tribe was the Ossegan. This is the name that Allegan is named after.
These are Dakota speakers. They're going to be completely eliminated in the process of these wars. You don't even hear about them anymore. In Michigan, we've got the Fire Nations, Fox Sox, Muscatine, Kickapoo. We don't think of those as Michigan natives, but back then that's who's living here. This is important for our third part of our story, and that's the fortification and the Indian battle. But the Fox Indians were here in Michigan. Again, you see that pressure. They're moving. First up to Green Bay, up along the Fox River, finally even farther west, trying to get rid of those Iroquois. The Iroquois are raiding all the way up into the Upper Peninsula. They're raiding all the way over to Chicago. They're raiding into Illinois, which is hundreds of miles, thousands of warriors on foot. These are massive armies. The Sox and the Fox, that's where Saginaw gets its name. They were up there, they are attacked, and their village with a couple thousand people is eradicated. Those that flee go up to Shiawassee, the Tittabawassee, up the Flint River trying to get away, and over a period of years they're eradicated. The remnants will come over into the Grand River where the Muscatine are. That's part of our story. The Little Prairie Indians, these people are called, they get into a war with the Ottawa. There's so much pressure that everybody is fighting everybody for turf. And the Ottawas are being pressed out of their area. They will come over into Michigan and they will take on the Muscatines and they will eliminate them from the northern Michigan part. The Muscatines again are starting to come into the Grand Valley for refuge. Eventually in history they will also be pushed into Wisconsin. Kickapoo, you don't hear much about the Kickapoo, but they were down along the prairies south of Detroit, the open grasslands. They too end up in Wisconsin for a period of time. Everybody's using the Lake Michigan as a barrier because the Indians couldn't canoe across. You had to follow the coast. And thousands of people were up in mid-Wisconsin here. They ran out of food. It was very dire, very hard times. The three fires are consuls here in Michigan, the Odawa, which is Ottawa, the traders, the Ojibways, the Potawatomis. That's who we're famous for. But where did they come from? Real quick, you can see the Ottawa started up here on Georgian Bay and Lake Huron. They were all the way up along the river, the Great River, Ottawa River, going to Montreal. With all the Hurons, the Iroquois, they're running first up to the Sioux, up to St. Ignace. Finally, they get pushed even farther west due to the pressure. And through all this, they were a tough customer, though. The Ojibways knew how to fight. The Chippewas were farther to the north, but they're migrating into the UP. The Chippewas was probably the most successful tribe. They were the most numerous, and they ended up conquering the most territory. Potawatomi, we think of as Michigan, they're kind of a mystery, but way back in the 1600s, they were up around the Alpena area, and they got pushed out into Wisconsin during the difficult times, during settlement time. We know them from Milwaukee, Chicago, all over to Detroit. This was the Potawatomi territory. So things changed a lot in a period of time. And going back to our story of Arthurburg, we had the great Indian battle that our ancestors told us about. I've read every account I can get. Sue was copied all the reports off that she had. You will hear the words Miami. You will hear different tribes. You'll hear one story talked about the Neutrals coming out of Ontario. We have Potawatomi. We have Ottawa. We have Chippewa. Miami, I think I mentioned. One even mentioned Menominee coming down and coming up the Grand River. So a lot of this I think is garbled. But what we do know is that there was historical battle that took place on the Grand. And again, I think we've got some truth. The story is true. I had one afternoon I had a phone call with Wilma from the local Lyons group here, and she told me a lot of Indian stories over the phone, and she told me the story of this battle. And I'm not disrespecting Wilma. I honor Wilma by this. The essence of the story is true. I'm a firm believer. The archaeologists, when they say there was no battle here, that's probably not true. He's wrong. We have an oral tradition between the Chippewa and the Ottawa. We have proof in what happened to the Muscatine, the Little Prairie Indians. They were decimated in their lives while they were in Michigan. They lived after they got eradicated up here, they came down to the Grand. Their brothers, the Sauk, would move over to join them on the Grand. And if you look at Kent County, Ottawa County histories, they'll talk about the three great Indian battles on the Grand, when the Ottawa and the Chippewa united with some other tribes in an alliance to finally eradicate the troublemakers. And what they did is there was a major battle at Grand Haven, the mouth. You still have Battle Point by Grand Haven. The second one is right down in Grand Rapids, on the hill of Grand Rapids where the Miracle Mile is, where all the hospitals are now. When they were doing work on Fulton Street years and years ago for foundations for the new buildings, they come across the remains of a lot of dead skeletons that had been killed in battle. So we have archaeological proof of the Grand Rapids battle. And then the third battle, and this is again the history of the Indians, is that they met here at the junction of the Maple and at the Grand, where they finally eradicated these people. And the remnants ran for what they could. They go up around the Pierre Marquette trying to get away, where the story is told that they are finally found, surrounded, and they're annihilated. So these tribes were almost, just a remnant would end up continuing to be over here in Wisconsin and Illinois. So Arthurburg was the site of an Indian battle, but we have history later. This site was built by ancient people that were here from the Mississippi and from Europe. Their cultures had blended with the Indians that were here at that time, so you had a unique culture. And then later, that site was sitting here, and it was used by the Mascoutins for a very important site to defend the Grand Valley. As the Ottawa came up the great portages from the Huron into the Grand, coming up from the south, and the Chippewa are coming out of Saginaw. They're coming down the Shiawassee. They're coming over the Bad River into the Maple. They're coming. What Wilma said is true. It's just some of the names have been confused. So it's a long road to get there, but I think the Indian stories make sense. And when you put it in a historical concept of where these people are and where they're at, this is probably happening. So by 1700, they're gone. They're not going to live here anymore. And I'm moving through this one real quick. And this river is called the Owashtenong. Sometimes you'll hear Washtenaw. That's how that name is English. But the Indians called it Awash. It was because it was the Grand River. It's the longest river in Michigan. And these are just early maps, but I think the key thing is here as you look at, you're going to see the word portage on here, and it showed the ancient highway the French used. In 1688, they knew about this. This was the waterway, and that's why the Ottawa and the Chippewa, that's why this battle was fought. Next one. Here you get 1719, you can still see the river systems. The maps are changing as they're starting to understand geography. The fact that by 1718, that they knew this, it's amazing. 1744, look at the detail they're adding, and they're starting to understand the Michigan topography. And again, you can always see that portage that you see here where they're crossing the state. This would have been used by those early explorers and fur traders. They're following the Indian ways. Look at this, 1755, French and Indian War. Look at the detail on their maps that they had. So they knew the turf. Here's the French country with all the forts. For us, the key thing is here again, they had enough presence. You don't see a lot of rivers here, but you see the Grand, you see the Shiawassee and the Saginaw. This is the highway. And today, this is a big cross-Michigan canoe ride. Jim Woodruff out of Portland's done a lot of work on this. The kayaking business is booming. People are back on the rivers. Here's the 150th birthday for Michigan. There was a group of people that recreated it. They traveled Michigan. There's the news clipping out of the Lansing Journal back then. And this is a map that's available. So I'll have this both for Sue. All these slides I'm going to give to Sue. All these slides are going to go to Margaret. So either one of your groups will have these. So if there's things that you've seen you want copies of, they'll be able to print it out. But this is the local network you'll see. You can see here, here's where we are today. You can see this is a combination of rivers and trails and the different ways you could crisscross Michigan. We're at the center of it all. And again, you see that this is available. These are maps that show the Potawatomi, their main villages. It lists who was who based on their chiefs. Here's your Ottawa. Here's Kokush at the famous junction of the rivers. And Chippewa, Eastern Michigan, by now they've conquered, they pushed the Dakota out. So they own Upper Michigan, they own Northern Wisconsin, all the way into Minnesota. The treaties, this is of course a big part of it. Where we're at today was part of that Saginaw Treaty. 1890, Arthurburg was sold by the Indians. A lot of the Chippewa would move out of this area and they would move farther down the Grand, so the population would kind of boom here. Some of them went north. And here's a picture of that watershed that all this took place in. So again, these are a lot of resources. The next part of this I'm not going to talk about, but this is out of the Grand Rapids Museum. It's an example of what a village would look like back then when our first settlers came. These are some line drawings that are excellent for education and coloring that would be nice to hand out in our museums. And the next few slides, Beth, could you just kind of skip through these? These are some things I'm working on that I thought would be nice to put together for our museums, to hand out for young children. And some of this is things that I didn't know. We talk about the gardening, and we talk about their different huts, whether it was bark or the mats that the women would make out of the reeds and grasses. the tree bark. We didn't have the hides that we see out in the Cheyenne and the Sioux, but they would use the tree bark from the birch, the slippery elm. The Iroquois tribes, they would use the longhouses, and these would have been up at Mackinac when the Huron were there. And the insides of what they looked like, pretty amazing. This is something too, fishing, any fishermen here, you know the old sturgeon runs? Tremendous things. These things were huge, and they could come up the Grand, they would come up the Maple, up the Looking Glass, and I didn't talk about this, but on those charts, if you go back to those French maps, they don't follow the Grand South. You'll see the two fingers pointing to the east, okay? Those fingers are the Maple and the Looking Glass, because those were the two routes. Both of them, whether it's going to Chesaning or whether you're going to Shiawassee Town, you were crossing Michigan. But the sturgeon would come up. The Indians would, they would do this at night as well. They would light torches. In the Grand River, downtown Grand Rapids, there's a great story where the squads had torches for 1 mile up and down both sides of the river while the men are hopping around on the rocks out in the river, spearing. And these are, 100-pound sturgeons back then. These are monster things. Here you see an artist rendition of what it might have looked like on the Maple. They go up maybe to Maple Rapids where they could catch the sturgeons as they're going up the rivers. So, and of course, once they got the sturgeon, they would have to clean them, and they would take the meat, they would dry it and save it so they would have meat for later in the season. A couple examples, drawings. This is a current woman that's doing it, showing how they dry the meat to preserve it. It's a big part of their trial. This is trails. We've kind of covered all that, but just keep going as we go through these. A lot of these I put in here for our different historical groups. You can kind of get a view of kind of some of the artwork that's being done today. This is a really popular thing, but it really gives you a sense of what life was like here, and with the Native Americans moving on the water, moving on the trails. These trails are single file, they're not highways, they didn't have horses, so the water was the easiest way to move freight. The birch bark canoe, of course, is so prevalent. But one thing we don't remember is they also used the elm bark. The number one thing was the dugout. The dugout could be huge. They would take our basswoods, our lindens, and they could have 36, 40-foot pieces of wood they would make into a dugout that could haul a lot of freight. And of course, the Catholics, we don't talk about this, but the Indians became Catholic, and when America comes, they bring the Protestants. The Indians went through tremendous persecution because they would not renounce the Catholic faith. Okay? And you can continue to go through on all those. So we covered a lot of turf. We covered a lot of different things. But what was Arthurburg? Well, I think we discovered that it was a paper town, part of Americana, part of our early settlement with our white settlement. We talked about Arthurburg being an ancient site, and I think there's a lot of proof that there were some amazing things happen. I haven't answered the questions, but I think hopefully I've touched on so many things. There's one or two aspects that might encourage you to go home and hit Google, hit the Yahoo, and find out more about it. It's kind of like reading Rainbow. We all go home and start to read a little bit more. And the last is that our Native American culture, I think their stories are true. I think there was amazing things that took place here in Lyons Muir. I think Arthurburg was a big part of that. This is a very strategic spot because of the rivers. And we've seen that culture after culture. Lyons Muir is at the heart of it all. So thank you for your time today. I apologize for a short kind of disruption in the beginning. Hopefully you've learned something, and if I can help or answer any questions, feel free to ask. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, John. It was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Any questions? Comments? Yes, ma'am.
So where's the link? Where's the video?
Yeah, really. Where does my information come from? It comes from a lot of different books because you can't find that book. It doesn't have. I know. And again, I'm sharing all this information. I'm not doing this for the money. I do this for the love, okay? So again, if there's pieces here, your local historical society will have this as a resource. So feel free to contact them. I'll leave it on a smart drive today so that they'll have it. Just don't anybody else write the book and make $1 million and send me a thank you card.
Sue, can you turn the lights off?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. There are so many wonderful, amazing things in Ireland, England, and similarities to things in New England. There's a lot of commonality. So, again, that culture brought with them things.
Well, thank you very much. Hope you enjoy it.
Oh, it was wonderful. And there is still coffee and there are cookies in the back room. And as I said, this weekend is the,
I'm going to leave this whole slideshow.